Welcome back to the deep dive. You've sent us a highly unusual source this week.
Yeah, definitely different from our usual fare.
It's a piece of political rhetoric that feels less like, a policy paper and much more like a really deeply felt cultural manifesto.
That's a good way to put it.
It's just a single, quite intense document. And it seems designed to articulate this profound frustration from one segment of the American population about their relationship with the governing structure.
That's absolutely right. We are diving deep today into an excerpt titled "The Great Divorce They'll Never Sign: Why the Left Can't Let You Go and What Robin Hood Would Owe You in Back Taxes."
That title.
It is. And the source is cited as Pastor John L. Widdifield for Remnant Church and Online Ministries. So yeah, this isn't neutral analysis we're looking at. It's very much a specific framework for viewing the current national split.
Right. So our mission today, then, has to be purely analytical. We're here to unpack the specific arguments the author actually uses. What are the financial reasons, and maybe even more importantly, the moral reasons given in this text for why this hypothetical great national divorce is, well, in the author's view, deliberately resisted.
Resisted by the side he generally calls the left, or sometimes blue America.
Exactly. We really need to understand the architecture of this specific critique, not necessarily endorse it, but understand it.
Definitely. And the author wastes no time, jumps immediately into this foundational metaphor. It kind of bypasses all the usual language about unity or patriotism.
How so?
Well, they frame the whole political division not as just a disagreement over policy, but as a strange, stubborn, and sanctimonious marriage. That's the quote. Between two parties that apparently despise each other, but somehow remain bound together.
Strange, stubborn, and sanctimonious. That language choice itself is striking, isn't it?
It really is.
It sets a very specific emotional stage right from the start. It's not just saying, oh, these two sides disagree. It paints it as this deeply dysfunctional, mutually degrading relationship.
Yeah, the implication is pretty clear. One side, which the author aligns with red, or the conservative side, desperately wants out of this marriage.
And they feel trapped.
Precisely. And the text claims this side is being held captive. But not by shared history or, affection or anything like that, but by pure financial dependency.
Okay, so it's about money.
Fundamentally, the author uses this really powerful, almost domestic metaphor to illustrate what they see as abuse. The opposing side, the left, is acting like a dysfunctional roommate.
A roommate?
Yeah, a roommate who eats your food, maxes out your credit card, and calls you a fascist while doing it. That's the image presented.
Wow. Okay, that is a potent image. It really reduces the whole complex government-citizen relationship down to something quite petty, almost parasitic.
It does. It completely shifts the conversation away from ideas of shared responsibility or national projects.
And towards purely extractive practices, it sounds like.
Exactly. And so the ultimate central question that the source poses, the one that really drives the entire argument, is wonderfully cynical, you could say. It asks, if you left, who would pay the bills?
Right. That cuts straight to the chase.
It really does. By boiling the entire national conflict down to basically accounting, the source instantly reframes the whole political relationship. It becomes one of pure financial utility, completely overshadowing any claim of, ideological unity or national cohesion.
Okay. That definitely sets the stage. Let's dive into that first major section then. Analyzing this core claim that the conflict is really all about utility, not unity. So this section kicks off with this strong assertion: the refusal to allow what the author calls a red exodus, which they define as the splitting off of those who fear God, love law, and remember what a woman is. That refusal isn't about keeping the country whole.
No, not according to this source. It's framed as simple utility, purely utilitarian.
And the economic language used here is, well, it's highly charged, isn't it?
Extremely. The author makes this explicit claim that the tax base of one side, the side they see as productive, is nothing less than the oxygen tank for the other side.
The oxygen tank.
Yeah. And their productivity is the piggy bank. So this paints the blue side's programs and policies, which the author dismissively calls experiments, as being entirely dependent on the red income stream just to survive.
That oxygen tank metaphor is powerful. It suggests immediate, almost existential collapse if that subsidy is removed.
Right. It's not just that the system would be hampered or slowed down. The implication is it would immediately suffocate.
Which implies, from the author's perspective, that the left knows its policies aren't economically viable on their own.
That's exactly the conclusion the author leads you to. And to illustrate this supposed financial dependency, the source gives us a series of these really stark, contrasting examples. They seem carefully designed to hammer home this idea of a fundamental labor versus policy divide.
These aren't just random complaints then.
No, they feel like carefully chosen juxtapositions. They contrast tangible physical effort with what's presented as abstract, maybe even frivolous academic policy.
Okay, let's walk through these specific examples because these are the little nuggets of rhetoric designed to really stick with the listener, right? The source claims, you mow the fields, they write poems about grass equity.
Yeah, that phrase is almost a masterclass in rhetorical shorthand, isn't it?
Explain that a bit.
Well, mowing the fields clearly represents essential physical income-generating labor, creating primary resources, stuff we need.
Okay.
Grass equity, on the other hand, that represents what the author sees as the excesses of academic or bureaucratic policy, a focus on abstract, often expensive social justice concepts that get layered onto simple physical realities.
So the author is deliberately contrasting production with what? Philosophical expenditure.
Precisely. It effectively pits the person doing the physical work against the person conceptualizing the perhaps unnecessary theoretical framework around it.
Okay, that makes sense. Another example given is, you build the dam, they charge you for water justice.
Yeah, this taps into a classic critique of regulation, doesn't it?
Seems like it.
The builder, in this scenario, represents the capital investment and the physical risk needed for major infrastructure, something that benefits everyone. The regulator, or the policy setter, is then portrayed as someone who comes along and monetizes that essential resource, the water itself.
And not necessarily to maintain the dam.
Right. The implication is that the charge isn't for upkeep, but to fund some kind of ideological oversight that's labeled as justice. It reinforces that core idea of extraction being layered on top of actual productivity.
Got it. And then there's perhaps the most sensitive claim, because it ties the financial argument directly into a moral and social critique. That's the assertion. You raise the kids, they tell them in school that parents are optional.
Right. Now, the critique broadens out beyond just economics and infrastructure. It moves right into the familial and social sphere.
The labor here is different.
Exactly. The labor here is moral and parental. The immense effort of raising children according to specific values, specific beliefs. The counterclaim, then, is that the state, funded by those very parents' taxes, actively works to undermine that moral authority right in the classroom.
Teaching a doctrine where the parental unit is what? De-emphasized.
Or even considered extraneous, yeah. So the tax money, in this specific viewpoint, is literally paying for the destruction of the taxpayer's own foundational values.
That's a compelling way to argue that the financial extraction isn't just neutral. It's actively corrosive to the underlying social structure that the taxpayer values.
It definitely aims to hit hard on that point. And this leads directly into what the author calls the coercion critique.
Okay, what's that?
The central premise here is basically this. If the left truly believed their own ideological system, their progressive utopia, let's say, was economically sound, righteous, merciful, and prosperous, as the text puts it.
Then they wouldn't object to a split.
Exactly. They would welcome it. They'd be eager to demonstrate the viability of their system.
To prove it could stand on its own 2 feet.
Precisely. According to this source, they would actually beg you to leave just to prove the success of their system, unburdened by the supposed backwardness or interference of the red states.
So the refusal to even contemplate a split is framed as, what? An implicit admission of failure.
That's the argument, that they know it doesn't work without the subsidy from the other side. Their resistance is proof of their own system's non-viability.
And the source goes further, right? It claims that when the red side asks for what sounds like a reasonable compromise, something like keep our money and build in peace, the response isn't a calm discussion.
No, not at all. The response is characterized as purely emotional and accusatory. They supposedly clutch their pearls and scream, "Fascism!" So the rhetorical point there is that any kind of rational dialogue about separation is impossible because the resistance is rooted in financial necessity, not high-minded principle.
And labeling the request for separation as fascism is presented as the ultimate conversation stopper.
Yeah, an act of deflection, designed to shut down the discussion immediately and ensure continued compliance, continued payment.
Okay, so if we synthesize this first section for you, the listener, the author is really trying to establish a foundational framework here. The argument is that the political conflict isn't some noble ideological struggle between competing visions for the country.
No, it's being presented as a much cruder, almost transactional relationship, where one side, the productive side in this view, is essentially enslaved by the parasitic needs of the other.
Which reduces the entire political conversation to an accounting problem, fundamentally, rather than a unity problem.
That's the core assertion, utility over unity. Okay, so we've seen the argument about the financial necessity of keeping the red side contributing. Now, the source logically transitions into what it sees as the moral necessity driving that extraction.
So moving beyond just the money to the justification for taking it.
Exactly, focusing on critiques of what the author calls mandatory virtue and selective compassion. And this is where the specific examples really become tools designed to generate outrage and highlight what the author sees as blatant hypocrisy.
And the sharpest tool used here seems to be this healthcare paradox.
Yeah, that's a very pointed comparison. The author deliberately contrasts the treatment of working, tax-contributing citizens with those who, in the source's quite blunt language, break the law through unauthorized immigration.
And the specific ailment chosen is key, isn't it? Insulin.
Absolutely crucial. The source posits that if a working-class family, presumably one paying taxes, following the rules, cannot afford something as essential, as life-saving as insulin,
It's framed how?
it's instantly framed as capitalism's fault. The blame and the moral failure are assigned to the very economic system that the working family supports and participates in.
Okay, but then the contrast comes immediately.
Right away. The source claims that if someone, again using their words, breaks into the country illegally, suddenly there's a seemingly infinite pot of funding available.
And the services listed go beyond basic needs, right?
Way beyond basic triage. The list is deliberately designed to raise the stakes. Dental, therapy, and 4 years at Berkeley.
Wow. Dental therapy in Berkeley.
Choosing dental and therapy suggests quality of life benefits, things often seen as luxuries or unaffordable extras by many working-class families.
And adding 4 years at Berkeley? That's not just healthcare.
No, that elevates the provision from basic necessity to this massive, long-term, extremely expensive investment, and importantly, an ideological investment, given Berkeley's reputation in some circles.
So the rhetorical strategy is pretty clear. Why is this high-end social mobility and care apparently available to those who, in the author's view, haven't contributed or followed the rules, while essential health survival is denied to the taxpayer?
That's the question it forces. And the label the author slaps onto this specific scenario is incredibly loaded. Redistribution without representation.
That phrase obviously carries a huge historical weight in America.
It's a deliberate echo, absolutely. It invokes that foundational American grievance taxation without consent, without a real voice. The source claims the dear citizen, the one actually ponying up the funds, is not allowed to opt out of this mechanism.
A mechanism that, in this view, uses their own money against their interests and maybe even their morality.
Right. It transforms a contemporary policy debate into something that feels like an act of historical tyranny all over again.
This really highlights the core argument about mandatory contribution, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The author then asks what seems like a pretty natural follow-up question, one that probably resonates with some listeners.
Which is?
Why can't we just make these programs optional? Or, if not totally optional, why can't taxpayers redirect their dollars? Say, choose to fund only insulin for working families and not fund Berkeley for unauthorized entrants.
And the reaction to asking that kind of question, as described by the source, is really key to understanding the author's whole view of the system's supposed intolerance for voluntary action or choice.
What's the described reaction?
Asking for optionality or even just redirection is apparently met with, and I'm quoting again, a blank stare followed by a moral accusation followed by another tax hike.
Huh. That's a very sharp description of a perceived political pattern. First, like incomprehension that you'd even ask.
Right, like the question itself is illegitimate.
The moral shaming for asking it.
You're selfish or uncaring or worse.
And finally, increased financial consequence. Another tax hike.
Yeah. The conclusion the author draws from this alleged pattern is stark. Coercion is the fuel of their utopia.
Meaning,
if these ideological programs and these specific forms of redistribution were purely voluntary, they would simply fail, because the author believes that voluntary virtue doesn't keep the machine running.
So the system, in this view, requires forced contribution, which the author explicitly labels as theft, just to function at all.
That's the argument being made, which transitions us perfectly into the moral argument about theft, bringing us to that wonderfully provocative Robin Hood revision.
Ah, yes, Robin Hood. This is where the author goes straight for a classic, almost universally loved folk hero.
And turns him completely on his head, makes him into a villain, essentially, to prove this point about sanctioned extraction or sanctioned theft.
It's quite an intentional reversal of the cultural symbol, isn't it? Robin Hood is usually seen as this champion of the poor, the proto-libertarian maybe, stealing from a corrupt state to give back to the oppressed people.
But the source completely rejects that narrative, explicitly. The author frames Robin Hood instead as just a bandit who robbed one corrupt power to fund another corrupt rebellion.
So not noble at all.
No, just dismissed bluntly as a thief in green tights.
By simply calling him a thief, the source tries to strip away any moral ambiguity from the act of redistribution itself.
Exactly. The underlying message seems to be that the means, the act of theft, can never be truly sanctified by the ends, no matter how charitable those ends might seem. Stealing is stealing.
And the connection drawn to the current political climate.
Is that the left, according to this source, loves the figure of Robin Hood precisely because he justifies theft as long as it's for their cause.
So Robin Hood provides a kind of cultural and moral cover.
That's the claim. Cover for compulsory redistribution, allowing them to frame what the author sees as extraction, as righteousness, as social justice.
And the author doesn't just leave it as a cultural critique. They ground this entire argument very explicitly in morality, even scripture.
Right, to elevate the argument beyond just fiscal policy debates. The core argument is that no amount of positive social intention, no amount of talk about social justice can scrub the sin off what they're defining as sanctioned theft.
And this is where they bring in the Bible verse.
Correct. They invoke a specific foundational commandment. You shall not steal, Exodus 20.15. By citing this, the author attempts to transform the critique from a financial or political disagreement into a non-negotiable moral absolute, rooted in ancient religious law.
Stealing is stealing, period, regardless of who benefits.
That's the moral line being drawn. And they conclude this section by defining how, in their view, the opposition perceives the wealth of the contributor, which is the ultimate justification for this whole critique.
How do they define that perception?
They claim the opposition sees your paycheck as the sheriff's chest, meaning it's already sort of quasi-public funds, subject to state authority whenever needed.
And your bank account?
Your bank account is viewed as inherently oppressive, something suspect just by existing.
And savings.
Your savings are seen as the people's emergency fund, essentially communal property, just waiting to be tapped for necessary extraction when the collective deems it necessary.
So it's an assertion that the very idea of private ownership of wealth is, in the eyes of the system the author opposes, merely a temporary custodianship of public funds.
Ready to be utilized at any moment for the utopia, that's the picture painted.
Okay, so we've explored the source's arguments for why the red side is considered financially necessary, the oxygen tank idea. Now we pivot to the motives for retention. Why, according to this author, is there a refusal to allow a split?
Right, and the author asserts this isn't accidental, it's a conscious, calculated move. The text says, quite directly, they know exactly what they're doing.
Implying intent.
Definitely. And this section lays out the specific reasons, according to Pastor Widdifield, why one side refuses to release the other. And interestingly, they all seem to pivot on maintaining power and, crucially, ideological control.
Let's break down those three stated motives. The first one is,
First, your existence funds their experiments. This is essentially a restatement or maybe a reinforcement of the financial utility argument we already covered in the first section.
so the money is needed for these ideological programs that supposedly can't sustain themselves.
Exactly. It's the baseline requirement. But the second motive adds another layer. Your dissent exposes their failure.
Okay, that sounds more political, less purely financial.
It is. This feels like the rhetorical heart of the control mechanism argument. The idea is, if the red side were allowed to leave, and this is the critical part, if they were allowed to succeed on their own terms.
Building their farms and families in functional cities, as the author predicts later.
Right. If that happened, it would fundamentally challenge the validity, the legitimacy of the blue model itself.
How so?
It would serve as living proof that the progressive or utopian project, as the author frames it, is dependent on those external subsidies. It would confirm the source's core critique that the system isn't viable on its own. The success of the breakaway group becomes an indictment of the group left behind.
So the very act of successful separation becomes a kind of ideological vandalism against the Blue Project.
That's a great way to put it. Ideological vandalism, yes. And then the third motive shifts again. Your boundaries threaten their control.
Boundaries. Meaning what, exactly?
This seems to be the shift from pure finances or ideological proof towards direct social power and influence. The source makes this sharp claim that the left may sing about liberation but demand your compliance.
Ah, the contradiction.
Right. The liberation is presented as universal and abstract, maybe even theoretical, but the demand for compliance is portrayed as very specific, very personal, and non-negotiable.
And this speaks directly to the source's critique about the actual limits of personal freedom in the current system, right?
Mm.
The author argues that even though the country is called free,
Yeah, supposedly free.
the individual citizen cannot actually walk away with three really critical aspects of their self-determination intact. What were they again?
Their money, their morality, and their medical decisions.
Money, morality, medical decisions.
Yeah.
Okay.
The author suggests that the system asserts a level of control over these deeply personal spheres that fundamentally contradicts the whole concept of individual freedom.
So if you can't ultimately decide where your mandatory contributions go, that's the money part.
Right.
Or how your children are educated or what values they're taught, the morality part,
Mm-hmm.
or what medical choices you or your family make, the medical decisions, then the concept of freedom in practical everyday terms is rendered somewhat meaningless.
That's precisely the argument, that the label free doesn't match the lived reality of constraint in these key areas.
And the author uses specific rhetorical contrast to try and highlight the futility of even asking for decentralization or more
yeah.
local control.
Yes. For instance, if you ask for federalism, the classic American idea of devolving power back to the states or local communities, the response, according to the source, is just more federal enforcement.
So the request for local control is met with intensified central authority.
That's the claim. It backfires. And similarly, if you ask for personal choice on a sensitive social issue,
The response is?
the source claims, very provocatively, they give you a drag queen and a debt ceiling increase.
Wow. Okay, and unpack that juxtaposition.
Well, it's clearly designed to suggest that the response to what the author sees as legitimate concerns about personal choice or local values isn't substantive policy discussion. Instead, you get an ideological symbol, a drag queen, which might be intended to provoke or signal values,
Coupled with?
coupled with an overwhelming, seemingly unrelated financial burden, a debt ceiling increase. The implication is that the core request for localized choice or individual autonomy is ignored or even mocked in favor of symbolic centralized messaging and just piling on more national debt.
That makes sense as a rhetorical strategy.
Mhm.
And this leads to what is arguably one of the most effective or at least memorable rhetorical moves in the whole piece, the tax season irony.
Ah, yes. This observation really aims to capture the perceived hypocrisy in the system's relationship with the conservative taxpayer, as the author sees it.
How does it work?
The author starts by pointing out that, generally speaking, the left is often portrayed, or perceives itself portrayed, as viewing the right with, frankly, open disdain and caricature.
Using stereotypes.
Exactly. The source claims this pervasive stereotype is that the right is just a racist, Bible-thumping, cis-hetero, gun-loving bumpkin, hitting all the negative tropes.
Okay, but then
But then the author highlights the sudden, almost whiplash-inducing transactional shift that occurs when the system needs capital, the moment money is required.
especially around April 15th.
Precisely.
Right.
During tax season, this previously despised figure, this pumpkin, is instantly recast. Suddenly they become a vital stakeholder in our democracy.
Ah, that's the irony.
That's the core irony, yes. This is meant to be the critical aha moment for the listener who's following the source's internal logic. It supposedly confirms that in the author's view, the relationship is purely mercenary. Deeply held values, or even basic respect, are secondary, perhaps entirely irrelevant.
Until the cash flow is threatened.
Exactly. The citizen is only vital, only a valued stakeholder when their wallet is open and contributing.
It's definitely powerful political satire.
Yeah.
It aims directly at what the author sees as a fundamental lack of ideological sincerity.
Yeah, the argument is the system needs the money, desperately needs it, but it simultaneously holds the provider of that essential money in deep contempt until it's time to collect. So, having spent all this time establishing why, according to the author, this divorce won't happen because of that claimed financial dependency and need for control, the text then engages in this really quite radical thought experiment.
Okay, what if it did happen? What if the separation were somehow forced?
Exactly. And this allows the author to really reinforce their central premise by predicting wildly different outcomes for the two hypothetical resulting nations.
It sets up a stark contrast.
Extremely stark. It lays out two profoundly different hypothetical futures, almost designed to prove that one model, the red one, is inherently self-sustaining and productive, while the other, the blue one, is inherently parasitic and doomed to fail on its own.
It sounds almost biblical, like a division of fates.
There's definitely that kind of tone. Within the source's speculative future, Red America would immediately focus on, well, tangible, productive, and traditional outputs.
Infectious.
They would build farms, families, and functional cities. The emphasis there is clearly on self-sufficiency, the creation of essential, practical infrastructure, and rebuilding social cohesion around traditional lines.
Things you can touch and measure.
Right. And the success in this prediction wouldn't just be internal, it would be rapid and outward-facing. The text claims that within just 5 years, this hypothetical Red America would be so productive
That they become exporters.
yes, an export powerhouse, sending out food, power, tech, and children who know how to read.
The inclusion of children who know how to read is interesting.
It is, because it
Mhm.
deliberately ties the predicted economic and technological success directly back to a moral victory in the education sphere. It's a direct contrast to the earlier critique about schools allegedly teaching that parents are optional. Here, education is functional again.
Okay, so that's the vision for Red America. Productive, traditional, successful. What about Blue America in this scenario?
Conversely, the author's vision for Blue America is one focused almost entirely on internal, social, and, well, bureaucratic expansion. They wouldn't be building farms or power plants.
They'd build what?
They would build DEI departments, safe injection sites, and public art installations about gender grief.
Okay, that selection is clearly chosen for maximum contrast.
Absolutely. The focus there is portrayed as non-productive administrative overhead, DEI departments, expensive social programs designed to manage rather than solve underlying issues, safe injection sites in this view, and ideological expression, public art about gender grief, all framed through a specific ideological lens.
The rhetorical contrast is incredibly effective, you have to admit. DEI departments and public art installations on one side.
Versus functional cities and exported food and power on the other. It pits bureaucracy and ideology directly against production and practicality.
And the predicted outcome for this hypothetical Blue America, is it self-sufficient?
Far from it, according to the source. The outcome is the importation of total failure. They would apparently import chaos, confusion, and foreign bailouts.
Foreign bailouts.
Yes. This paints Blue America as immediately and fundamentally non-functional, completely unable to sustain itself once it's cut off from its external financial underpinning, specifically, the author argues, the red state's checkbook.
So this hypothetical scenario directly leads into the source's ultimate collapse argument.
Exactly. The author states it very plainly. The reason the split is resisted so fiercely is because the second it's no longer your checkbook underwriting their utopia, their scaffolding collapses.
The whole argument rests on that dependency model being fundamentally fragile, like a house of cards ready to fall.
That's the bedrock assertion. And the text then concludes with this really powerful final word. It kind of blends reassurance for the listener who identifies with this view with a final condemnation for the opposition.
How does it reassure the listener?
It tells the reader directly, you're not crazy for feeling the way you do, for seeing things this way. And it asserts that the opposition is not noble in their aims or methods.
And it circles back to the money.
It does. It restates that core financial conflict with one last sharp line. Your wallet isn't their confessional, implying that financial demands are being used as a tool for moral imposition.
And just as the author grounded the critique of theft in Exodus earlier, they finalize this whole condemnation with another scriptural reference.
Yes, invoking Isaiah 10.1. Woe to those who decree iniquitous decrees and the writers who keep writing oppression.
Using iniquitous decrees and oppression.
Right. This final scriptural quote is clearly intended to lend a kind of timeless theological weight to the political and financial grievances laid out in the text. It suggests the opposition isn't just fiscally irresponsible or politically misguided, but actually morally condemned by ancient prophecy.
It definitely aims to end on a heavy note.
Okay, so we have spent a good amount of time navigating this highly volatile but definitely rhetorically structured polemic. It's strong stuff.
It really is.
Okay.
And for you, the listener, the immediate value of doing this deep dive, we think, is synthesizing the specific arguments being deployed, especially in this specific, very highly charged corner of the national political debate. Understanding the narrative is key, regardless of whether you agree with it.
Absolutely. It's about mapping the argument.
So let's quickly recap the 3 core claims we've analyzed from this text. The claims that really define his particular narrative about national division and financial control.
Okay. First, the source fundamentally tries to reframe the entire political structure. It argues that the motivation for keeping the current union together isn't about shared vision or unity at all.
But pure financial utility.
Right. One side's tax base is literally the oxygen tank for the other side's survival and projects. That's claim number 1.
Okay.
Second, the source constructs this specific moral argument against mandatory redistribution. It uses that Robin Hood revision as a key example.
Rebranding Robin Hood as just a thief.
To justify the idea of sanctioned theft, and asserting that coercion, not voluntary virtue, is the necessary fuel for the opposing ideological system. That's claim 2.
Got it. And the third core claim.
And third, the source ultimately claims the conflict is about control, specifically control over personal boundaries. It defines real freedom as the ability to retain control over your money, your morality, especially in educating your kids, and your medical decisions.
And the inability to simply walk away with those things intact is presented as proof.
Proof, in the author's eyes, that the relationship isn't about choice or freedom, but fundamentally about demanding compliance.
So this deep dive really provided a detailed analysis of one specific narrative out there. A narrative that seeks to transform what might look like policy disagreements into a much deeper moral argument about economic extraction and control.
Yeah, it's a powerful framing, whether one accepts it or not. Which brings us back to a thought from the source's own conclusion. It was simple, but quite provocative. Freedom means the right to say no.
Right. And that leads directly to our closing thought for you today. If you take the source's core premise seriously, just for a moment, the premise that the system is designed such that the government dictates where all these funds must go, and that any attempt to redirect or retain those funds is met with moral condemnation or accusations.
Then what does that phrase, the right to say no, truly mean for an individual citizen operating within that context? Is there a meaningful right to refuse?
And maybe more broadly, if the core of this political friction is framed, as this source does, as fundamentally about financial extraction and ensuring compliance, is the debate we hear every day truly about governance and competing visions for society?
Or is it perhaps just a struggle for the power of compliance itself?
Something to definitely consider as you process the ongoing, often heated discussions about national unity, division, and where we go from here.